This is a panel which is going to deal with the international arena, and my first question to all the panelists, and as I said, the audience can open as I explained, you can answer, and I can answer the question, and we will get the response of the audience later. The similar question to all the panelists. Rank the events or developments that will influence the coming decade. 1, global economic crisis. Second, nuclear chaos, with different states rushing for military nuclear capability. 3, rapid, slow process of political, economic weakening or even disintegration among the following: China, Russia, and the EU, the European Union. I will start with, if I can, with Michael.
Thanks. Whoa. I have a more powerful voice than I realized. I think what we're looking at in the coming decade is an international system that is going to become, it's already there, but it's going to become a competition between authoritarian capitalism and democratic capitalism. And it's going to be Beijing versus the United States. And the big question for the Middle East, I think, is whether the United States is going to see competition with China. It would see the Middle East as an important arena for that competition with China. My own personal answer is that it should, and the United States should be focused on the Persian Gulf, and it should worry about a Chinese, Russian, Iranian alliance to drive the United States out of the Persian Gulf, take over the resources of the Persian Gulf, cut off Europe from, or have control over Europe's resources.
Michael, I think what I would like to see now is you ranking among the 4 issues: global economic crisis, nuclear chaos, rapid or slow disintegration, weakening of the economies, and widening, what may be the widening of the rift inside the United States. If you can rank them and explain what will be the...
So I think we should assume that there's going to be competition between China and the United States, and that's going to be ongoing. If there's a crisis, there's no way to predict that. The key issue is preventing Iran from serving as China's instrument in the Persian Gulf, which means the Iran nuclear question is very much at the top of should be in the Middle East, the top of the agenda. But the problem we have is that there's no clear strategic conception in the United States about how to fight this war. So we are so polarized, and even on the right, there's no consensus about fighting this conflict in pursuing this competition in the Middle East. On the left, there's no consensus. I think if you're an Israeli, the thing you should worry about is the United States just picking up and leaving, and then you'll be alone opposite a nuclear Iran, combined with this continued disintegration in the Arab world, which Iran has developed tools for exploiting.
Irina?
Thank you. I believe that as far as global international crisis is concerned, actually it's questionable, because according to the economists, well, the present growth rates are high enough If you take the United States, it's around 2.6, 2.4%. If you take developing countries, it's much more, it's 4.5. The problem might be with Chinese economy, which is really slowing down, but it will be compensated by the growth of Indian economy. So economists in Russia, anyway, they do believe that in 5 years, I don't know what will happen in 10 years, of course, since we might have some black swans, like we have a virus now in China, and people say it might affect its economic production. But if there are not many black swans, the global economy doesn't look as a crisis economy right now, and in the future probably too. What is more dangerous from my point of view is a collapse of the strategic agreements on containment of nuclear weapons, on strategic containment, like START. If it is not renewed, if it's not signed, it's a real problem because it decreases mutual responsibility, and it will not allow to verify what's going on, and it means that we might face a new rise of nuclear weapons, a new rise of nuclear competition, which might be dangerous not only for the two countries which are engaged into it, first and foremost, Russia and the United States, but for the whole world.
If I may, I want to, if we can put the question to the audience to rank. Is it possible to put the question? For the audience to use the application which Adi explained, which of the following will have the most influence in the coming decade? Global economic crisis, nuclear proliferation, or 3, political weakening of China, Russia, or the European Union. You should rank them, and we will give the answer at the end of this round. Stanley, the question to you, in terms of the events or processes that influence the next decade.
Well, thanks very much, and it's a pleasure to be here in front of this very distinguished audience. The problem about these things is that there are some well-known laws in economics, one of which is crises take a very long time in coming, typically longer than people expect. But when they come, they happen very quickly. And so it's a bit hard to decide which of these developments will be the most important in the coming decade, because we're not that good at calling the timing, even when you can understand the underlying forces. And the second thing I would say is that these issues are very heavily interconnected. It's simply not true that whether there will be a global economic crisis is independent of whether the widening bipartisan rift in the United States continues. We have started, since the Trump administration came in, the US has started giving up its dominance in the global international system. Will this continue? Well, it depends on the American election results. But that certainly will affect what the global rate of growth is, which is the first point. So I'm a little concerned about anybody putting any weight on these things, because we, whoever wants to deal with these issues, will have to deal with all these issues simultaneously. And it's very hard to say which will be more important within the next decade. Whereupon, my excuse having been given, I would start. I think that the U.S. weakening, the possible bipartisan rift in the United States, weakening the central political, judicial, and economic institutions, is the most important factor in the current world economy. We had a world economy that was run fundamentally by the United States and its allies. The United States wants now to do America first, and it understands America first as being very much focused on America and much less on other countries than was done before, when the assumption usually was if you helped the global economy operate rapidly, at least for allies of the United States, you were strengthening the United States as well. So I would put the widening bipartisan rift in the United States, weakening the central political, judicial, and economic institutions as being the critical factor. We had a global hegemon between 1945 and 2016. We are reducing that role, and we don't know how the new global economy is going to work. We know that the trading system is being taken apart at the moment relative to what was put in place at Bretton Woods, and that is a very, very major factor. That's how the developing countries got to grow as rapidly as those in East Asia and others have done, and that may be disappearing. It depends on the election results in the United States. The other two, nuclear chaos, it's already started. What's going on with North Korea is nuclear chaos, and we'll have to find out how that ends. But it started a long while ago. It started certainly with India and Pakistan, which developed nuclear weapons within very, very close proximity of time to each other. And my sense is that, to the amazement of many, the nuclear system has been managed reasonably well until recently. And I suspect that it has some self-controlling mechanisms within it, namely, whoever starts may pay a huge price further down the road. On the China-Russia-EU cases, rapid or slow processes of political economy weakening, and even disintegration in one or all of China, Russia, and the European Union, I think that China and the European Union have already introduced measures, already suffered measures, which will indicate a process of weakening and possibly the beginning of disintegration. That is Brexit, which is a huge change for the EU, moving the organization of the leadership of the EU to a tripartite United States, Germany, France, and Britain is very different from the Franco-German alliance, which ran the EU before Britain joined, and which will have to step into the breach that the departure of Britain leaves. That will be very serious. So my sense is that, and what's happening in China? Well, there are two things happening in China. Number one, the record of countries which grew at one point at 14, 15% a year after they started reforming is that they end up growing, in one case, as Japan is, hardly growing at all. In another case, Korea, it's growing, but it's not growing much faster than the rest of the world. And China has been slowing down along the path that the previously leading country did, and that was Korea, in terms of the longest period of rapid growth. And I think China's on that route. They've also put in place another problem. China, any visitor to China who goes around and meets regional governors and things like that is impressed by the quality of the bureaucracy. That quality was one which was based in part on a serious merit test in the way that the Chinese traditionally had handled political choices, and as they were handling them after the 1949 change of government. That has changed when they nominated a president for life. Those systems are not very successful over the long run. They will probably survive perfectly well in the coming decade, but they really ought to obey the rule of 10. The rule of 10 says that nobody in a position of great power should be in it for more than 10 years. They start giving way to corruption, and there is a lot of corruption in China, and they start giving way to just the fact that the system doesn't change as rapidly as it should. But if I got to put numbers on this and not spoil the game, I'd put US weakening as number one, the main problem. Slow and negative growth in the global economy, which I think is roughly the same issue, in the second position. And I think that the China-Russia-EU question is more serious for the next decade than what will happen to nuclear chaos. Thank you.
Thank you, Stanley. This is exactly in the last sentence you ranked them, and I wonder how it will influence the audience response. Andreas, the view from Europe on the order of risks and dangers to the global scene in the next decade.
Right now, I would not be too worried about economic imbalances or an economic crisis ahead of us in the next decade. Equally, with regard to the political imbalances or possible disintegration with regard to the three countries or the group of countries you've referred to, I would not be too concerned. And I might comment on Stanley Fischer's remark about the European Union, because I'm in charge of the Brexit negotiations in the German government, and I must say it came rather as a surprise how well the coherence was preserved among the 27 in the negotiation process of the exit agreement. And this is something which we've done now. Objectively, I think it's very clear we not only regret the loss of the UK as a member of the European Union, it is also objectively a weakening of the European Union, but this was not our decision, of course. But the more important question for the future is the question, what happens to the 27? What happens to the European Union after the UK has left the Union? And here I'm far more confident, I must say, not only that I believe that there are other leadership candidates who are now joining France and Germany in actually plotting the path ahead for the European Union, also the willingness of members to actually handle this very complex, this very complicated file has been remarkable. Last remark from my side, when we look at the nuclear dimension, and I would be most concerned with regard to the next 10 years when looking at the nuclear dimension, it is not just nuclear proliferation. Yes, that is one challenge. But it is, and I think Stanley Fischer referred to it when he spoke of chaos with regard to North Korea, it is the question of the stability of the existing nuclear powers that gives us reason to be concerned. And on top, I think I would add, because not too many people discuss about this, it's most regrettable that we have lost the INF Treaty. We have an arms control architecture under pressure at the moment, which will produce very significant cost if that architecture is further weakened. So the question of what is going to happen to New START is a centrally important one. And also one important question that is out there where we will see how it will be answered and how it will shape reality is the question of how the US deals with China in arms control terms, because we can already feel very strongly how the US applies existing or attempts to apply existing regimes or design new regimes with regard to China. And as we all know, the Chinese portfolio, in a way, also when it comes to nuclear, is a unique one, and thus this will be an additional challenge ahead of us.
Thank you, Andreas. Can we show the results of the audience response to this question? אני לא רואה, אז מי רואה? אני פה לא רואה כלום. וזה רחוק ולא רואים מפה. אני לא מחובר, אז אני אקום ואני רואה. אוקיי. 291 answered. Political and economic weakening in China, Russia, or the EU. Majority, 48%. Global economic crisis, 35%. Nuclear proliferation, interestingly, only 18%. Related to the answers to Michael.
The 18% are the smartest people in the room.
I'm going to ask the question still. It seems that the United States and certainly Europe do not want to exert military power on rogue states, whether it's North Korea, Iran, or even to certain actions by Russia, China in the geographical environment of these two powers. Sanctions work or will not work?
The problem with this survey, I think, is the question is, where are we sitting, from whose point of view? Because are we looking at this from the point of view of God or from the point of view of the Israeli Prime Minister? I'm going to look at it from the point of view of the Israeli Prime Minister. The Israeli Prime Minister can't control what happens with Russia and the EU, can't control global economic crisis. What the Israeli Prime Minister can influence is the question of nuclear proliferation, and Israel has a huge influence on the American perception of its role in the Middle East and of its options. It's true, America, like Israel, has a problem of, in the Middle East, of turning its military power into lasting political benefits. And America has less experience of doing that in an area of constrained military activity, politically constrained military activity. But as the Qasem Soleimani elimination shows, The United States can send a drone from a base in Qatar and take out the most powerful guy in the Iranian system with relatively minimal impact militarily for the United States. The problem for the United States is not using military power. The problem for the United States is a political one of using military power that will lead to large numbers of U.S. casualties. Now, the United States still has interest in the Middle East, and it can work through allies allies who are more comfortable using military force in order to secure those interests. This is a huge opportunity for Israel. America first does not mean America retracts to its borders, puts up a wall, and is no longer involved in the world. America first is a huge opportunity for Israel, and we saw that last night. The key for the Israelis is to understand the limitations, the right and left boundaries under which President Trump is making decisions about military force. He has a right-wing constituency that's part of his base that that wants the United States to pull out of the Middle East entirely. What Israel can do, like Winston Churchill said in World War II before the United States got involved, you give us the tools and we'll finish the job. So Israeli military power, backed up by American military power of the kind that was applied against Qasem Soleimani, can be an incredibly powerful influence in the region, and it can increase the value to the United States of Israel. Because when America looks around and tries to secure its interest in the Middle East, there are very few partners it has who have the ability to use military power beyond their borders, and Israel is number one in that regard.
Okay, thank you. Stanley, sanctions work, sanctions will work if the aim is controlling nuclear activity of certain rogue states. Iran, does it work? North Korea, does it work?
Well, in both those cases, it works somewhat. For a long time, it was stated that sanctions never work. Then sanctions really worked, certainly on Rhodesia and certainly on South Africa. And so there are examples of countries which were treated by sanctions successfully. Many that were treated unsuccessfully by sanctions. Now, the statement that states with military power are reluctant to use it doesn't seem to me to apply to Russia, which has used it in Ukraine, has used it in Georgia, has used it on its immediate neighborhood. And I'm not sure how to categorize the building of islands in the seas off China, but it certainly looks like a military move since it's been put there to provide military bases. So they seem to be willing to use military pressure. Now, the U.S. prefers economic to military pressure in this administration, and I think most people would prefer economic to military pressure if it worked. Nobody's very anxious to get out there and have dead people coming back to the country. So I don't think that the Iranians and the North Koreans are going to comply with non-military pressure. I think the non-military pressure should be maintained, but there should be a willingness to use military pressure, and obviously the Soleimani case looks like an example of why the combination works well. Now, how to deal with these problems? To my mind, the major problem in the global system at the moment is that Europe is not carrying its weight on the military side, and it's relying very much on the United States. And what you see in the American administration at present is a reluctance to continue the systems of the first 70 years after World War II. Thanks.
Thank you. Irina, given the relative weakness of certainly the economy of Russia, is Russia overstretched? Russia is in Libya, Russia is in Syria, Russia is in the Middle East generally, Mediterranean. Is it too much for the power of Russia?
Well, thank you for this question. I'm afraid I will disappoint you, since, first of all, the cost of the operation in Syria is relatively low. It's not a costly operation. But what's more, the Middle East turned to be a window of opportunity for Russia. Because if you look at our arms sales to the MENA countries, you will see that MENA countries now make up 21% of those countries who are buying Russian weapons. But it is not only about weapons, because if you look at trade, you will see that Egypt, for example, buys 2/3 of its grain from Russia. And if you look at technologies, you will see that NPP technologies are introduced into Persian Gulf. So there is a real need for Russia, and Russia is getting benefits from its engagement in the Middle East. The question is first whether it will be for a long time, because Russia is hotly greeted by the countries of the region because they are not sure that the states will stay there or will be ready to defend them if something happens. So they are longing for a system of check and balances, and Russia fits this role. So right now, I would say that Russia was quite successful in the Middle East, and it brought even economic benefits. Thank you.
The last question, and for all the panelists, and I want you in 1 minute, rank 1 minute each, rank the following and explain your ranking. We spoke about the possible geopolitical risks in the next decade. In the following list of issues, what in your view will impact our lives in the next decade the most? Climate change, cyber, either political, economic, or military warfare, and the third, economic global recession. Rank the most influential in your view. This is also a question to the audience once again, and when the panelists end their answers, we will see your ranking. Andreas, please start. 1 minute, please.
I would say all three contribute to a phenomenon which, from a European, from a German perspective, is more important, that is migratory flows. I think migratory flows will produce an enormous challenge in the decade ahead of us, not just in handling the flows themselves, but also with regard to the root causes that produce them, because we're looking at an increasingly high number of weak states. When we look at the Sahel, north of Burkina Faso, Niger, countries we usually don't speak a lot about, have become centers of insecurity where state structures have completely disappeared, and which open gates for migratory flows, either out of these countries or out of sub-Saharan Africa that we have not seen before. And of course, climate change contributes to this, economic weaknesses contribute to this, but I would say from a European, from a German point of view, because it has an enormous impact on the internal policies of European countries, if the destination of these migratory flows will be Europe, and I'm sure in an important way it will have an enormous impact.
Stanley?
Thank you. Well, very quickly, I think that the most important problem on that list is climate change, but not for the next decade. So let me go through what really matters in the coming decade, and I share Andreas's remark on migration. The important element in this is that population predictions will have African countries having a much greater share of global population by the turn of the coming century, which is some way off, than they have now, and that will make that problem even worse. But for the coming decade, I think the problem of global recession and its consequences, I would put number one, I'd put climate change number two, in the sense that if we don't start dealing with it now, we're going to have a terrible time, not in the coming decade, but somewhere down the road. And thirdly, the cyber political economy, military warfare nexus strikes me as something that we're going to have to live with for a long time, but that it won't be the dominant factor in the coming decade. Thank you.
Thanks. Irina?
Well, you didn't mention the rise of the new generation. I believe it's very important because we now are having new generation all over the world, and those people who have just come into the market, they are very much unsatisfied. There is a large gap between them and their aspirations and what the governments can offer. And actually, I believe it will be a real impact on the developing of all countries all over the world, but first and foremost in the Middle East, as I see it, because even in the rich countries, you see the generation which is well educated, but which cannot find a proper place in the political system, which has no voice, and it's a very important trend which should not be ignored. And I would like to add to that while we all are very much scared of a climate change because we cannot do much about it, at the same time there are things which we can do something about, like fake news, because we don't know in what reality we live right now. And it's really very bad because we receive information which cannot be verified, but can have very destructive impact on decision-making even, on security, on military intelligence, and so on and so forth. So I believe this is a thread which should be studied in the future.
Last but not least, Michael.
I put the cyber. Cyber is the most important thing in my mind, or going to have the most influence. We can already see it happening. On a personal note, in the last 25 years, I've gone from being a left-wing Democrat to a conservative Republican. I managed, unlike many of my friends, to retain some friends in each group along the way. When I talk to them now, I'm really struck by the fact that we do not have a common fact basis on which to discuss what's happening in the world. And we're talking about radically different perceptions of what's true and what's false. Did Russia influence the last election? Is Donald Trump an anti-Semite? I have left-wing friends in the United States who think that Donald Trump is dead set on destroying the Jewish people. I come here and I talk to my right-wing Israeli friends. They see it very differently. This has created an opportunity, along with the destruction of the press in the United States. The internet has destroyed the press as we knew it, for enormous opportunities for influence, manipulation, and delusion And I think it's something that we should all be, left and right, should all be putting our minds together to work on.
Let's see what the audience is, the verdict of the audience. Climate change, 42%. Cyber attack, 30%. Global economic recession, 29%. They are not worried about the economy, Stanley. Many thanks to the panel.